Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start. We have a guest speaker, and Alexis, if you would like to introduce, and we'll
Yes,
cover our stuff at the end.
yes, and I'm hoping maybe a few other folks will pop their heads in too. I am very, very excited about our conversation tonight. I know one of the things that we've been talking about for a while, sort of broadly, is this idea of um, who are different potential types of partners that we can work with when it comes to housing. I know we've had lots of conversations about sort of mission-driven developers and sort of what's on the table. And so I am so thrilled that I work with somebody very brilliant in this area. My colleague, Karolina Ramos, is done great work on faith-based affordable housing partnerships specifically, but institutional partnerships broadly. And Karolina is a policy program manager at Urban in the Research to Action Lab. And she manages partnerships and research projects on topics related to inclusive economies and equity-driven policymaking in communities, including work on upward mobility from poverty, equitable local uses of federal funding, affordable housing, and transportation. And I am not going to read her full bio because it is extensive and quite amazing, but I'm very, very thrilled. Karolina and I work together very closely on other projects at Urban. And so I'm really excited that she's going to be able to be with us tonight and give us an overview of how some other folks are thinking about affordable housing partnerships, and then we'll have time at the end for some Q&A as well. So I will turn it over to you, Karolina.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Alexis, for the very lovely introduction. I'm really excited for the chance to get to chat with you all. As Alexis said, she and I work together really closely on a lot of urban projects, but I know that she wears another cap as a local elected official, and it's just nice to get like a little glimpse into that work. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you're seeing a PowerPoint. Yes?
Yes, we do.
Awesome. Great. So I'm going to start at sort of a top level overview of where we are in the housing space, zone in on some example work that we've done at Urban, looking particularly at Nashville, and then kind of zoom out again to examples from across the country, including at least one initiative out of Atlanta, so we can get a sense of sort of the broader landscape of this topic and queue you up for any questions you have. I should also say, if there are questions that pop up while I'm speaking, please feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand, go in the chat if anything is unclear. Just to give a little bit context about my work and the work of the Urban Institute. So Urban is a nonprofit and nonpartisan policy research organization. We're based in Washington, D.C., but we have staff really scattered throughout the country, and we do work in communities across the country and have a lot of research that's focused in particular on housing. So my colleagues at Urban have done a lot of really great work sort of outlining the nature of the housing crisis and how we got here. And actually this week, some colleagues at Urban released this project called A Roadmap to Address America's Housing Crisis that digs much deeper into each of these. But to sort of lay out the state of where we are in terms of affordable housing, we're definitely in a challenging point, and we've got here for a few reasons. One is the sort of trend of chronic under construction of housing since the Great Recession that's underpinned by a few things. So one, we see really restrictive zoning and land use policies across the country. We see a lot of communities that have zoned for single family housing, which makes it really challenging to get denser multifamily housing, duplexes, things like that that are really responsive to the housing need. We also see a lot of rising development costs and financing barriers, especially sort of peak pandemic, peak lockdown. We saw a lot of supply chain challenges that just made it really challenging and really costly to build housing. So we were sort of at a standstill for a couple of years and have sort of reached this inflection point. We also have a lot of aging housing stock that requires a little bit of a different approach from, building new housing. We need efforts to repair, to rehabilitate housing, to preserve housing. Certainly for people who want to age in place, modifying housing so it's responsive to people's mobility as they get older. All of those are sort of pieces of the puzzle of the current challenge that we face. And there's lots of different approaches that are necessary to tackle this. And there's no one approach that's going to sort of be the singular answer to addressing the housing crisis. So we definitely need to expand housing supply. We need to build new housing. We need to preserve existing housing stock. But we also need to think about supportive programs for people who are trying to enter housing, right? So it's really, really hard if you're a first-time home buyer right now to keep up with rising home prices. If you want to put 20% down, but that 20% amount keeps getting higher as home prices get higher, it can be a really huge barrier for first-time buyers. And we also know that renters are seeing really big spikes in rental rates, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the Nashville context. So on the end user of just like people who need housing, we need investments in that too. And of course, we need to think about assisting people who are experiencing homelessness, not only temporary shelter, but really transitional housing into more supportive long-term permanent housing. So today I really want to focus on expanding the housing supply. And one partner that we're seeing that's showing a lot of promise to start to fill some of these affordable housing gaps. So across the country, we are seeing a lot of momentum and movement around houses of worship using underutilized land or underutilized properties that they own and converting them into affordable housing. And we're seeing this as part of what's called the YIGBY movement, or Yes in God's Backyard, in response to the NIMBY movement, or Not in My Backyard. So we're seeing a lot of momentum around this across the country. And at Urban, last year I was part of a project that was focusing on this topic in Nashville in particular. So Urban has a partnership with Amazon and its Housing Equity Fund, which looks to make investments in affordable housing in Amazon's 3 core market communities. So the greater DC area, the Nashville metro area, and Seattle and the Puget Sound. So those 3 employment hubs for Amazon. And at the time that we were scoping this project, Metro Nashville, they have a consolidated government, so it's a city and county government, was really putting a lot of effort into understanding what publicly owned land existed. So what does the government own? What is available in terms of public housing that may be underutilized? And we were really curious to think about other type of landowners in the community that could be leveraged, because we kept hearing about what a challenge it was in Metro Nashville to even just find land to build on. So we started to examine institutional landowners and like anchor institutions, and we focused on these 3 buckets. So we looked at healthcare institutions, colleges and universities, and then faith-based institutions. And we'll dig a little bit into what we found and then sort of zoom out on some of those trends. But to start, just want to give you a sense of Nashville's housing dynamics, which may be really familiar to you in the Atlanta metro area, because I imagine they're quite similar. So the median home sale price last month, or I should say, I guess 2 months ago now in Nashville, was $455,000. And just 5 years ago in 2019, it was $300,000. In Tucker, the median home sale price in August was $410,000. And 5 years ago, it was closer to like $260,000, $270,000. So you all have also seen a really major bump in home prices in like a fairly short time period. In Nashville, over the course of the year that we were doing this project, so from 2022 to 2023, the median rent rose almost 10%. Which was the 5th highest rent increase among 50 major US metros for that time period. So right now, median rent for a 2-bedroom in Nashville is around $1,800. In Tucker, it's around $1,650.
Karolina,
Yeah,
can I make a comment just, for everybody's benefit? That median sale price in Tucker, a lot of that is because not just that homes have gone up that much, as it's the new construction being at such a high price, because the only inventory we have is some of the new construction, and most of it is in the $700,000 to $1 million. So
yeah,
I don't want anybody going away thinking that their home value has doubled in 3-4 years.
For sure. Yeah. And I think Nashville's seeing a really similar trend. A lot of what's being developed are very high-end homes, and especially in the rental market, a lot of the new construction is luxury units. And it's interesting. We, at the time, over the course of this project, we were seeing a lot of new development come up. We did site visits to Nashville where you can literally like see things being built, all at these sort of luxury amenities and luxury rates. And then we would revisit it a few months later and see that those same property managers were then offering like 1 month free, 2 months free, 3 months free, because they were having such a hard time getting people just in the buildings to sign leases because it was so exorbitantly priced. So there was like a real mismatch between what the market was for like market rate housing, but also where demand existed for that type of housing. So definitely lots of nuance to that data for sure. To put it into broader context in terms of the housing gap that Nashville faced, so the Metro government has a affordable housing task force, which estimates that by 2030, so really in just under like 5 years, they need to develop over 53,000 units of housing to meet demand and to meet the growth that they anticipate in the region. And of that, at least 18,000 need to be available for households that are earning at or below 80% of area median income. So it's a big gap. And we were trying to understand whether institutional landowners might be able to meaningfully fill that gap. So to do that, we gathered property data and tried to identify developable land, again, owned by those three types of institutions: faith-based, academic, and healthcare institutions. And we were looking at developable land sort of in two buckets. So one is land that's totally unbuilt, where there's a parcel where there's no structures, or parcels where there's partially built land, but there's still space for development and it's been zoned for housing. One major caveat here is that in the data, it doesn't differentiate for partially built land where some of that is like surface parking lot. So our estimates sort of represent the upper limit of what's possible, recognizing that in some cases, developing new housing might mean taking away from some parking spaces, which I know is like a very contentious issue for people. We also wanted to assess transit adjacency because we know that housing and transit are so closely linked. You know, if you have affordable housing, but you are way out of the community and you're disconnected from core services, you have a really hefty commute to get into the community to go to work or go to the doctor, the infrastructure really isn't serving you well. So we also looked at transit adjacency based on who is in a quarter mile of the WeGo bus stop, which is Nashville's sort of rapid transit system. And from that, we assess the possible number of units that could be developed under current zoning on those developable land parcels that are zoned for housing. So what we found is that across those three institution types, over 5,500 units could be developed under current zoning today. And again, this sort of represents like the upper limit of what's possible, what the potential is, but without modifying zoning, without having to go through a bunch of development hoops. This is what's possible. And we know that, you know, it's a long way from that 50,000 mark, but it is certainly something of a contribution in the broader context of affordable housing. And then what we were sort of surprised to find was just how much of that potential is housed within faith institutions in particular. So in Nashville, the most development potential of the parcels that we examined is on land owned by faith-based institutions. So you can see that based on this chart, let's see. So of the acres that faith-based institutions owned, about 57% is zoned for development and is available for development. So that translates to about 2,800 units that could just be constructed on land that's owned by faith-based institutions. And you can see that they also have the most in terms of land that is partially built. Again, that may be because of things like parking lots, but it also, you know, reflects that some of these churches, synagogues will have like community centers or other structures that are sort of adjacent to their congregation. So again, we have 2,800 in terms of potential units that could be developed by faith-based institutions. Fewer of those are transit adjacent than in academic institutions, which makes sense in terms of, you know, how we think about where campuses are located. So Vanderbilt, Tennessee State, they tend to be more, you know, clustered and closer to the downtown. That's a little bit more transit adjacent, but still a lot of potential for that on faith-based land. We also found that faith-based land is the most diverse in terms of the housing types that it's currently zoned for. So we were looking at single family, duplex, and multifamily zoning. And faith-based institutions, the land that they're on is zoned for just a much bigger mix of housing types than the other institutions that we studied. So we really saw a ton of potential and also a ton of like momentum and interest among faith-based community members in Nashville, which I think is like in some ways unsurprising, right? Like we're in the Bible Belt, we're in a community that's very faith-oriented, where there's loads of congregations. But I think there was some degree of surprise of just the development potential and the value of land that they owned and the potential for that to be transformed into housing. So let's zoom out a little bit to just think about what are some of the incentives, but also some of the barriers to why faith-based groups might enter into development, as well as some of the incentives for partners who support them. So as we said, we're seeing sort of a broader trend around this YIGBY movement and sort of a mission-based approach to housing. A lot of faith-based institutions want to be responsive to the challenges that their community and their congregations are facing, and housing is a huge pressing issue. And it's especially so among community members who are really vulnerable, who are low income, who are getting rapidly priced out of housing. So there's sort of an intrinsic mission-based motivation there, but it can also really bolster institutional finances for a lot of these faith institutions. Leasing or selling land or structures can really be a financial boost, especially if faith institutions are seeing like a dip in congregants that are typically supporting them. But there's also a lot of variables that might make an institution feel more compelled or a little more wary to get involved. So one is just like land availability. In some cases, institutions might already own land. They might have developable land that's on or adjacent to their congregation. But we've also heard of cases where faith institutions are purchasing land. They site it with a nonprofit housing developer or with a foundation, and they have to assemble financing to purchase it, assuming that land is available and is zoned for housing. The second one I think is a really, really big factor. So it's just their own capacity and expertise to do this work. In conversations we had, it's like pastors were like, we don't know about real estate, which makes a lot of sense. You would not expect pastors and synagogue leaders and mosque leaders to be like deep in the weeds of real estate. And so they really expressed a need for some kind of technical assistance, trusted partners who understand and can navigate permitting and construction, any zoning permitting that needs to happen, and then beyond the construction, actual property management long term. So this is a big one. It's like whether or not this is an institution that has ready partners in the community to support them. And finally, financing. Considering whether leasing land or selling land might be a better fit for an institution. I should also say, affordable development doesn't just happen on its own. And there may be the impression that faith institutions sort of innately feel like, well, we should just do it at an affordable rate. Like that's the right thing to do. But that is not always the case. Market rate housing can be really lucrative. And there are trade-offs for sure in thinking about what portion of the housing is affordable, what portion is market rate, and then how you finance that. Are there tax credits that are available? Are there grants that might be available from state housing agencies? What's the state of federal funding? A lot of communities received federal American Rescue Plan Act dollars, and a lot of that went to housing. But that was sort of a moment in time where some of those funds have dried up. And so what's the landscape of federal and state support that can help make these projects real? So if we zoom out a little bit, just to look at some national models, I think the case I really want to make is that there's no one size fits all to faith-based housing, and the types of developments that are possible can really vary depending on community need and space and capacity. So for example, in Arlington, not far from me in DC, Arlington Presbyterian Church sold off a church structure that it had to a nonprofit developer to develop affordable housing, but to preserve the bottom level of the building still for ministry and services. So they still have sort of operations within this building. So this is a 173 unit affordable complex. It's all affordable housing. I have to double check, but I want to say it's 60% AMI and below. This is densely built. It's 1 block away from a metro stop. It's super close to a bunch of amenities, very easy to get to. And this is the type of scale of project that serves, a lot of members of the community and was also supported through a number of different financing avenues. So there was a nonprofit developer, there was Amazon funding involved, there was some state financing involved. So really a big blend of funds to make this project possible. But then on the other spectrum, we have this case out of Boise, Idaho, which is very small. This is a 2-unit deeply affordable structure that was built on a parking lot that a church owned in Boise. And it is committed to housing two families that make at or below 30% of AMI. So folks who are like pretty deep in poverty. And because it's a smaller scale project, it can afford to sustain that kind of deep affordability over time, right? Like there's fewer costs associated with property management and with the land and with maintenance because it's a smaller scale project. But this was what this institution sort of had the space for. And, housing two families is better than two families not having housing at all. So there's really these different ends of the spectrum of the scale of these types of projects. And then in Nashville, in the Antioch neighborhood, is sort of a different type of model entirely, which is a little bit more of a sprawled out development on a parcel that's under construction now, which is mixed income single family housing. So this is a project associated with Mount Zion Baptist Church, who partnered with a local nonprofit housing developer and a local foundation to build 150 units. Again, it's a mix of affordable and market rate, but what they heard from the community and from people who were really struggling to afford housing was a real desire for single family development. So to be responsive to that, they scoped out land. This was not initially owned by the church. It was sort of assembled with partners to purchase the land and build out this sort of broader community development that was really responsive to what they were hearing about a general interest from community to not have quite as dense housing, but to have a little bit more of a spacious design. So lots of ways to make this possible in different community contexts. As we were doing this work, we heard some pretty consistent things about what makes these partnerships possible and successful. So number one, favorable land use policies really go a long way, at least in the Nashville context. So there is a federal religious land use law that sort of protects religious institutions from zoning regulations that might be considered especially burdensome to their religious exercise. And Tennessee has a state level law that reaffirms and kind of expands upon the federal policy, the Religious Restoration Act, which really streamlines the permitting and zoning process for faith-based institutions that want to develop housing. And we heard time and time again from developers and from faith-based institutions that law, that zoning law locally, made a lot of development possible with faith-based institutions. It made the development process shorter overall. So those type of favorable policies can be really, they can really facilitate development locally. Again, we heard about trusted partnerships with developers. A lot of institutions see that they could play a role in housing, but they don't have the in-house expertise to know about real estate. They don't know about permitting or zoning. And they also want to be sure that they're not going to be taken advantage of with an unfair land deal or contract that isn't aligned with their interests. So we heard a lot about the need for trusted partnerships with local developers who have expertise, but also have the best interests of the congregation in mind. And one way to do that is sort of these local capacity building efforts that build cohorts of developers that are really plugged into the community. So in Nashville, the Urban League has started this program called the Real Estate Developers Academy, which focuses on developers of color and sort of builds up training around real estate development, a network of fellow developers, and then connections to local partners that are seeking to develop. And we heard of a number of projects with faith-based actors that came out of this academy, where people just had really long-standing relationships in the community. They were members of congregations themselves, and it really facilitated strong partnerships for that work to happen locally. And I would say nationally, there's also avenues for broader capacity support for this. So Enterprise has a faith-based development initiative. I was trying to poke around to see if they are doing work in Georgia. They do have efforts in just, they call it the Southeast, which I would assume to include Georgia, but they have technical assistance and training, as well as a number of like guidebooks and sort of policy briefs on how faith-based institutions can get started with housing development. And then the Local Initiative Support Corporation has local chapters that also do partnerships with faith institutions on housing development. We're also seeing just a broadly more supportive policy landscape for this nationally. So Atlanta, it turns out, actually has its own faith-based development initiative, I learned. So the goal, as I understand it, is that the administration is seeking to build 20,000 units and estimates that faith-based partners could help contribute about 2,000 of those. And then we're seeing policy at the local and at the state level Kind of the big one that got a lot of attention in the last year is California's SB4 Affordable Housing on Faithlands Act, which encourages nonprofits to partner with faith-based institutions to build affordable housing, in particular to focus on multifamily homes. It streamlines the permitting process and it overrides certain local zoning restrictions, so it facilitates a much smoother process for faith institutions to use their land for housing. Senator Sherrod Brown's of Ohio, his bill would do much the same. The Yes in God's Backyard Act in the Senate would also offer technical assistance and incentives for faith-based institutions looking to develop affordable housing specifically. And then we're seeing some like really fancy acronyms happening in Rockville, Maryland, the Faith Zoning Text Amendment, facilitating affordable, inclusive, transformational housing. I was very impressed by the wordsmithing on that. Is also seeking to kind of support that through zoning reforms to make that possible. So we're seeing momentum around this. We're seeing policymakers recognize the contributions that faith-based actors could have to housing and really try to streamline the process, recognizing that permitting and zoning can be really cumbersome and it can be really time consuming. So trying to incentivize that a little bit more and really encourage faith-based institutions as really active players in this space. And I would leave you with just this call to think about the way that your organization can engage in this and sort of the roles of different actors in this space. I think sometimes housing can feel like it is sort of the purview of government, and it certainly is in terms of incentivizing housing construction, bolstering supply, supporting affordable housing through things like vouchers, but there's lots of roles to play, right? So anchor institutions and communities can obviously offer their land, but they can also offer advocacy and financing capacity. In the Nashville context, faith institutions definitely had deep relationships with government actors, but so did Vanderbilt, and so did Vanderbilt Medical Center. And even in the cases where they didn't have land, they did have enough sway with local government to advocate for funding investments in housing, or to advocate that when federal funding is coming through, that should be directed toward housing efforts. So they have roles both in terms of the literal land that they can provide, but also their role as advocates. Developers can then partner with institutions to provide expertise and technical support that they need on financing, construction, and property management. I will say in the Nashville context, we saw a lot of nonprofit developers interested in this work, but at our last event where we were showcasing our findings, it was not just the do-gooder developers in the room. There were a lot of for-profit corporate developers in the space who had typically done for-profit projects, but we're really eager to sort of seize on this opportunity and to commit to at least having a portion of their construction be dedicated to affordable housing on a voluntary basis. Nashville doesn't have a lot of baked-in incentives for affordable housing. The state has actually preempted any efforts around inclusionary zoning. So there's not a lot of baked-in incentives, and yet we still saw corporate for-profit developers recognizing the opportunity and the potential of how much land was available to develop specifically affordable housing. Community members are really important advocates for decision makers and local elected officials on this topic. Research and advocacy organizations, the urban institutes of the world, can help communities think about really evidence-based practices for development, but also doing the type of data analysis that assesses what type of land is available and what could be zoned for housing. And then finally, we need policymakers to sort of step up to the plate. And I think one really promising area is just thinking about zoning reform. Right now, so much land is zoned for single family, and we could spur a lot of development and fill a lot of affordable housing gaps by looking into more multifamily housing, into duplex housing, and sort of reducing actual competition on some of the single family housing where you're getting folks whose income level is appropriately matched to the rate of rent or the rate of home prices, and sort of reduce pressures on the housing market overall. So there's roles for everyone to play. I'm sure there's roles for all of y'all to play. And I hope that would be sort of the main takeaways, that there's lots of opportunities for institutions to play their part, but also a lot of opportunities for community residents to call on policymakers and institutions to get involved in this work. So that is all I had to share, and I would love to hear your questions or your thoughts on things going on in Tucker on this front. Any questions about the work in Nashville or trends that we're seeing nationally, I'm happy to be responsive to.
Thanks, Karolina, for doing that. So yeah, I think, and also, if you want to stop sharing your screen and we can, yeah, so we have a few minutes to just sort of talk about and ask questions. Does anybody have a question right off the bat that you want to lift up?
I just have one question about, the corporate investors, the homes that have been bought up, and I can't remember the statistics on it in Atlanta, but I think I've heard like 30% was bought up by corporate investors. Is there any talk about being able to, is there any way to control that so that, because I mean, they pay cash and they overbid on the houses and, people can't afford them when they're bidding against that kind of money.
Yeah, I hear you. This was a huge topic in Nashville too, that a big part of what was pricing people out was corporate investors. And so we heard a lot about folks who would sort of leave Davidson County, which is where Nashville is, go to adjacent Williams County, and then Williams County would see a spike in corporate purchasers. And then, okay, we're to go to the next county, right? I don't off the top of my head know about sort of like centralized efforts to combat that. I'm sure that there are sort of like policy levers you could pull around limits on corporate investment, but I don't know enough about what that would look like and whether that would require federal or more like state level intervention. I can say in Tennessee, I don't sense a lot of like eagerness to combat that. The Tennessee state legislature doesn't have the most friendly relationship with Nashville, and often tries to preempt a lot of efforts, and tends to be a little bit more like laissez-faire and hands-off in terms of the market, right? Like, well, if this is the trend of the market and corporate investors want to buy, then like go for it. I think that what can be done in terms of like land use is that when faith institutions are entering into like lease agreements for how their land will be used, they can put provisions in place that will require a certain portion or all of the housing to be affordable. They can license it for a certain period of time to ensure affordability over that time. In the case in Boise, the church that built the 2 homes on their parking lot, the lease agreement they entered for the land was like $1 over like 100-year period to really ensure that this was not solely profit driven. So even if there aren't sort of federal or state policy intervention that can prevent that type of corporate purchasing, there are ways that lease agreements and seller agreements that faith institutions can enter can have really specific provisions around preserving affordability to at least ensure that if there were to be a corporate purchaser of that land over time, they would have to follow the letter of that agreement by preserving affordability, which may be one way to tackle it. But I totally share that frustration about just the scale of corporate purchasing is wild.
I know, I'm glad you mentioned the state preemption issue in Tennessee.
Yeah.
Like that is, I think, one of Georgia's big issues around this too, right? Is that there has been quite a successful lobby at the state level that there are actual restrictions on what kind of regulation can be done right now. So I know that with the tenant bill that was passed in the last legislative session, there are some inroads into sort of beginning to get to a place. It's not all the way, Guy, to your point of like being able to do much regulation, but it does codify better rights for tenants. And I think Georgia was like one of the only states that didn't have protections for tenants. So that was a big step that I know Senator Jackson was really pushing for and instrumental in getting passed. So just as an FYI for folks on that. I was also curious, because I know one of the things that we hear a lot in terms of residential areas is that NIMBY piece, right? We don't want people in residential areas. What has been the experience for faith-based institutions doing these types of things in terms of neighbor resident pushback or acceptance?
Yeah, so one example out of this in Nashville that we were looking at from a few years ago was a church that ultimately was successful, but the process to get there was really contentious. Wanted to build a tiny home community on their property, specifically for people experiencing homelessness and more specifically for people who had like major medical events and needed respite after like a surgery or a major hospitalization for a short time period. So it wouldn't be permanent housing. It was sort of intentionally transitional, and got major pushback from the NIMBYs about sort of like proximity to homelessness, basically. At the time, that state religious land use law was in effect. And so the church went through the zoning process in their capacity as a faith institution. And they got a lot of pushback from the community because they were like, well, you're a faith institution, but you're operating right now as a developer. And so if you're a developer, you should have to go through all the zoning and permitting hoops that developers usually have to do when they want to construct. And so it went through multiple rounds with the zoning board to try to assess, is this really a religious land use, in which case they can bypass some of those more onerous zoning processes, or is it just like a classic development? Because they had also partnered with a nonprofit developer. And ultimately, the church was successful in making the case that this was an expression of religious land use. You know, they were serving a community need. They were prioritizing really vulnerable community members, which was very much an extension of their mission as a faith group. And so it set precedent really in the local zoning policy for future faith institutions to do that. But again, like it was not without contention. And I think some of that is informed by the target population for this, right? Like this was very much intentionally for people experiencing homelessness. I don't know if it would have quite the same connotation if they said, we just want to build affordable housing. But there still is stigma in some communities around that phrase affordable housing, where people think like, oh, I don't want to live next to poor people, frankly, right? Even though we know people who benefit from affordable housing are working and they're contributing to our communities and they are seeking reasonable rents. So there's definitely contention around it. But I think that case out of Nashville showed that there's precedent for successfully going through the zoning process and leveraging that state religious land use policy to make the case as a faith institution that housing can be seen as a religious land use and can be done in a way that's much more streamlined than it would be if you were trying to go through as like a classic developer or as a community development corporation, where the process would be more onerous.
How did you establish with the nonprofit developers? I mean, how does one find a nonprofit developer? Is there a national association of nonprofit developers that
right? It's like
they're
shipping it, there isn't. Yeah. No, it's a great question. So what was hugely helpful in this research work was we partnered with a local group called Think Tennessee, which is a statewide policy and research group that primarily works out of Nashville and Memphis. And because they had a housing policy team, just had like really deep relationships with developers in the community. And we started, when we were kind of socializing this work, we started first with local government and with the planning department, who helped us kind of vet, like, what should we be researching in this space, and helped us kind of land on this institutional landowner lens. And then through Think Tennessee as a local partner, we had done a bunch of desk research and just did like cold emails. Like we just looked up major developers in Nashville, reached out and were like, we'd love to talk with you about this project. And then later learned through Think Tennessee that there were some relationships there. So there was definitely, there's definitely quite a bit of like cold calling and just like a lot of Googling to see what were recent developments that had been taking place, who were the major funders. And we started with sort of the nonprofit and more mission-based developers. And then later over the course of the project, as we built out those relationships locally, as we connected with other institutions, even like the real estate division at Vanderbilt, right? Word of mouth kind of was making its way around the community to then bring in other developers who conventionally had really just done like for-profit projects. We also sort of serendipitously, the timing of this was that around the timing that the report was released, Nashville's new mayor had just gone into office, who is a big housing advocate and a big transportation advocate, really someone who's very intentional about developing relationships with the developer community. So we were able to share the report with his office and his team, which I think also drew attention to local developers who were eager to understand the mayor's new housing platform, but also what kind of the development potential was. So it was a mix of like really building local relationships over the course of like almost 2 years, and a mix of very intentional Googling. But it's interesting. I was just at a HUD event on this topic around faith-based development, and something that kept coming up was a real need for that type of centralized like database or repository of some kind. And someone even brought up like we should be a trade association of like faith-based developers. And so like I don't know that a central database exists, but there's definitely appetite and interest in that kind of resource to understand the landscape of like who's in this, who has a long history and track record of like successfully building affordable housing, of leveraging tax credits and different financing to make it possible. So it doesn't exist, but maybe it should.
Steve has put a question in the chat.
Let's see. Okay, maybe I missed this, but are the resulting projects usually rental with long-term or perpetual affordability? Any projects for sale with limits on resale prices similar to Habitat? Yeah, so the ones that we observed were long-term affordable rental housing. In cases where you would have like perpetually affordable land that's guaranteed to be that way, there's usually like a community land trust involved. And we didn't see as much of that in Nashville, but in the report, I think we do raise a couple of examples specifically of universities that have entered into community land trusts or have otherwise entered into land ownership agreements that have requirements for long-term affordability. But of the projects that we saw, they were commitments to long-term affordability. And I would say one pathway to that is through mixed income housing. So you have housing, let's say, in a more dense multifamily like apartment building, you have a mix of market rate and a mix of affordable. And so the market rate sort of offsets some of the losses of the affordable housing. I will say, I think I mentioned this earlier, like affordable commitments don't always just happen. My colleague on this work, Peter Tatian, he, before doing this work with me in Nashville, has done a lot of work just in the DC area on affordable housing and was talking to us about a faith group in DC that is contracted with the DC Housing Authority to manage affordable housing. And over time, the land that they've owned has wildly gone up in value. I mean, like DC, as I'm sure like is true in Atlanta and in Nashville, rent rates right now are nuts. And so the market rate that you can get for a rental unit is really high. And this faith institution has like pretty deliberately let this unit go into disrepair. It's been pretty negligent in terms of property management, because if they don't live up to their commitments that are outlined in this agreement with the housing authority, they'll be let out of the contract agreement. Once they're let out of the contract agreement, they have no obligation to maintain the affordability rate. So they could start to charge market rate. So they could make way more money than what they're making now. And so there's a little bit of this like perverse incentive to not be a good landlord for affordable units, because then you're let out of a contract and you're free to make a lot more money. So there's definitely some intentionality required and definitely really robust financing required to make that affordability viable long-term. And so we saw a lot of partnerships between faith-based institutions and housing developers who are leveraging tax credits, funding from like state housing agencies, local housing funds. I think Nashville is unique in that because Amazon operates there, they put philanthropic dollars there. So there's some funding coming from a corporate funder, which not every community has access to. So I think a sort of blend of finances can make the affordable dimension just much more feasible than if you're struggling to kind of scrape this together. You kind of need market rate to offset the costs because developments are really expensive to build. So it takes intentionality for sure to preserve that long-term affordability.
I wanted to go back to some of the like earlier things that you were talking about. One thing that stood out to me, which I just wanted to highlight for this group because I know it's an ongoing priority as a age-friendly city, was, you were talking about aging in place. And I don't know if everybody knows this. I was at a presentation in the spring with Mike Carnathan with the ARC, and he had done a analysis of sort of like all the demographics of the DeKalb municipalities. And I think that Tucker was the oldest, if not one of the oldest, in terms of like the demographics. So in terms of our like number of people in our community and their age, it's definitely a much higher percentage than other places. which I'm sort of curious your thoughts both about, Karolina, about what that means for, seniors who have homestead exemptions and their taxes are not going to, their property taxes are not going to go up if, at all. And sort of what that opportunity in terms of creating housing for folks who, maybe are limited or fixed income, but have retirement, right? Have savings, have made a lot of contributions, and just sort of your thoughts on like how we think about housing when it comes to that aging in place component.
For sure. So one of the most compelling examples we saw in this work was actually not necessarily a faith-based institution, but universities. And we were looking at the model out of University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which has committed various investments around specifically preserving housing. So older housing stock downtown, where a lot of older residents live, and they sort of recognize that as a really important demographic of people who, one, might be at risk of being priced out because they're on a fixed income. But two, in terms of like safely aging in place, having homes that are, ADA compliant, that sort of evolve with you as your mobility evolves was really important. And so have really funneled a lot of their funding into preservation of that housing, which is a different equation than like building and constructing new housing, where you can have like loads of tax credits involved and all these development costs and construction costs. The preservation, you can sort of leverage a couple of existing pathways through like local housing agencies that often will have like repair grants that are built in. Programs like Habitat for Humanity will sometimes have supplemental funds for that. So it's a little bit of a different like funding pool for that work and that those efforts. I did recently learn of an effort.
Karolina, you muted. Karolina. I don't know if she can hear us.
No.
I'm trying to.
Karolina?
Hold on, let me.
Albert, can you unmute her or no?
No.
She saw my message.
There you go. Welcome back.
I was on like a real spiel. I don't know where I cut off.
At the beginning, pretty much.
Great. Okay, great. So we'll start. So
you recently learned, I think.
two examples that stuck out from this work that were really compelling. One was out of the University of Pennsylvania, doing work in Philadelphia, where a lot of the older housing stock downtown is home to aging populations. And so they were really concerned about people on fixed incomes getting priced out as prices rise in Philadelphia, but also that those same homes would be most prone to disrepair. So have invested a ton in rehabilitation, in preservation, and the funding sources for that can look a little bit different because it's a different sort of capital that you need other than when you're developing and constructing. So there's often, local housing agencies will have like rehabilitation and emergency repair grants, things that can kind of retrofit for like climate resilience, that can support the longevity of those homes. Some of the programs like Habitat for Humanity will have supplemental funds for that. So there's some different funding sources for that. And I also recently learned of an effort out of Arlington where there's just a lot of momentum around faith groups doing this work, to house aging populations, specifically who are LGBTQ. They were hearing about sort of a lack of spaces that felt really affirming and safe for aging populations in that space. So sometimes there's opportunities to sort of meet more niche community needs, but through, very like dedicated housing efforts that preserve that. To your point around like, you mentioned like having retirement and having savings. Just the question around like not being eligible for like low income housing, like subsidies or like vouchers because they have those assets.
I think it's just an ongoing trying to help broaden the horizon of what it means to have affordability needs, right? That like just because you may have, again, a retirement account or a savings account, that's not a reason to have market rate like So I'll just use the example of my
Sure.
father is in the only place that's available to him that he has, like, that we had to do, but it's $3,800 a month. And like, he does not have quite that level, like, you know what I mean? And so there's just not, and then the places that are like, we have two, really important critical senior like apartment facilities like in our city, but there are wait lists and they are, because they are so affordable. But they are also very, much income driven. And so
Yeah.
that was sort of my question. And there are also folks who don't want to live in an apartment, but they
Yeah.
don't need the maintenance on a 3 or 4 bedroom ranch or 2-story house either. And so kind of just thinking about how to talk about affordability for many different people. And I think for us in Tucker, particularly because we have so many seniors, and we have a lot of families like mine who want to move to Tucker but can't find a way to do that because there's not single family housing that's accessible and attainable to them. So
Yeah.
it's that balance.
Yeah, one model that comes to mind. So I'm originally from Vermont and from the Burlington area, which is going through sort of the same challenging dynamics of like people just getting priced out as rents go up wildly, and hearing a real desire for people to like age safely in place. And exactly as you said, Alexis, like people who don't want to live in an apartment, who have like different space needs, but also still want to feel connected and sort of in a vibrant place. And so there's been an effort in Burlington, which has a lot of single family homes that have been kind of converted into like makeshift duplexes, or like college students fit like 5 people into the house somehow, and thinking about how to maximize the use of those spaces where they will pair elderly folks with younger folks who will get a subsidized rent rate, and in exchange they will offer, various supports to people who are aging in place, right? So like commitment to weekly grocery runs, commitment to various like maintenance support in the house, committing to mowing the lawn, right? Like all of those things that might get more challenging as you're older, but still afford you a sense of independence where you're living in a space that isn't sort of a shared community setting, but you're still proximate to that sense of community, and you have someone upstairs or like right next door, who in exchange for lower rent is sort of building and fostering this relationship with an aging resident who may just have some more supportive on-site needs. And I think it's a really thoughtful solution because we see young people who are getting really priced out of the market because they don't earn enough to afford it. We're seeing older folks who have more specific housing needs, but also might be concerned about getting priced out. So that type of sort of creative pairing, I think, one is just a really good way to make good use of existing housing stock. But two, just sort of speaks to like two very different ends of like the affordability spectrum. I also think the models in Boise and in Antioch and Nashville that we looked at are really good demonstrations of what's possible for affordability that isn't like a super dense housing unit. Because I think that's what people kind of associate as like affordability has to mean density. It has to mean a bunch of apartments together, and it can look like that, especially in spaces that are zoned for more density. But it can also be, a tiny home on a parking lot where you're adjacent right next to a congregation, next to community services. It can be a community development that has mixed income, single family units. So we're not concentrating poverty in one area. We're having folks from different socioeconomic backgrounds in the same space, but we're building out bigger homes, that are not a studio apartment in downtown Nashville. So I think just demonstrating that like affordability can look like a lot of different housing models might be one inroad into thinking about the sort of specialized needs of aging populations.
How did that work in Vermont when they were talking about pairing elderly with younger folks in exchange for services? I mean, who did that? Was it like a group that took that on, or how did that happen?
I can look up. I'm off the top of my head, I don't remember if it was like the local housing agency. So Vermont has one of the largest community land trusts who are really active in some of that like creative housing solutions, and it may have been them. But let me find an article so I'm not making things up or speaking out of turn based on my memories, so I can send that to you. Because I can't remember who exactly was facilitating it. But I think that like notionally it was really positive for the people who participated. And I think it was piloted on like a fairly small scale, but again, is the type of thing that you could see replicated elsewhere really easily, where it doesn't necessarily take like a certain type of housing stock. It just takes sort of this matchmaking effort to happen. So I will find that article and I'll send it to Alexis to make sure she gets it to you.
And that, well, that was what I was going to say is I know that Karolina has a hard stop. And so if there are other questions or things that come to mind, you all know where to reach me and I know how to reach her. So I wanted to say thank you for your time, but I didn't know if anybody else had anything that they wanted to.
Yeah, I have a couple minutes if there's like one more question.
Yeah, Karolina,
So-
I do have a question.
Sure.
We have a, obviously space here in Tucker is a problem, but there's Meadowbrook Health Rehab that is right here in Tucker, and they have 8 acres that are behind their facility, and it's landlocked. There's no way to get to it except going through their, through their parking lot. And how would you go about getting a hold of the person to talk to? Because I had a meeting several months ago with Maureen Freehill from National Church Residences. And several years ago, when they were building the other 2 senior complexes, National Church Residences had looked at Tucker and decided not to because they didn't know what the demand is. And we already know now that the demand is huge for senior housing. I think that would be a perfect location because the rehab facility would have built-in potential future customers.
There's a pipeline.
And they can walk to, they can walk to Walmart and so forth.
Yeah.
So what would be your recommendation how to get started on something like that?
Yeah, so one of the kind of tricky aspects, at least that we found in Nashville, and I'm curious if this would be the same in Tucker. At least in Nashville, we were kind of surprised by just how little development potential there was on health institutions, which would include rehab facilities, in part because a lot of these are part of national conglomerates. And so they don't actually own the land on which their facilities operate, right? Like the clinic might be there, but there may be a totally different property manager who's responsible for the land. And so some of those like development decisions just aren't under their purview. So actually it would involve going to whatever the like LLC or developer is who actually owns the land, unless, the rehab division had like some type of community engagement staff or component, which I would assume to be like a starting point. But unfortunately, it may be the case that they aren't owning the land, but they're owning the structure, or they have a lease for the structure that they're sited on, which makes it a little bit trickier. But I would start with like, if you can find out whether there's like an LLC or a developer who owns the actual land, that might be an inroad into just understanding what's possible in terms of land use. Because I'm with you, like that could be a really potentially solid use of the space, and yeah, like a pretty dedicated pipeline of folks who would eventually need housing. But that was one kind of challenge that we observed with healthcare institutions, and why a lot of healthcare institutions, when they do get involved in housing, they're less involved in the direct construction development, and they're much more involved in advocacy, in grant making and financing. Sometimes they'll do partnerships with the developers where they'll have like on-site health visits. So it's a little bit more of a roundabout way of contributing to housing that's a little less direct than maybe an academic institution or a faith institution where they own the property and they own the land where they operate. So that would be the sort of the consideration I'd hold in engaging with that.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I know National Church Residences does have interest but the land is the issue.
It's the tricky part, yeah.
I just want to make a comment of a technical nature, and that is that there's a lot of information in the chat. And obviously, when this meeting is over, that chat information is going to disappear. So anyone who wants to save some of that information can open up the meeting chat. There's a menu at the very top with 3 dots, and you just click on those 3 dots and you click on Save Chat, and then it will create a text file that you save to your computer. So just wanted to remind everybody of that.
I can send y'all the links as well, so that they're so you have it in multiple places. Well, Karolina, I know you have somewhere you have to head.
I'm not a flight. But thank you so much for having me. I love being able to like pop in to like local civic organizations like this. And it's just really energizing to hear where there's momentum around this in other communities across the country. And if there's additional questions for me or just ways that urban can be helpful in sort of pointing you towards resources or best practices, happy to get those questions from Alexis and to respond. And just thanks so much for holding space for me tonight.
Thank you. Great information.
Very much.
Thanks everyone. And thanks Alexis for making the connection.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.